So far, it's fixing to get worse, so just hang on. We're moving in, as we started on 7, this idea of law. When's the law expire? On death, right? This idea of being severed and joined. In the Bible, that's what the word divorce means. It means to sever, to basically to sever it apart, right? Separate it. God told the Israelites that He would divorce them. Basically, He said, "I will," because you played the harlot, right? In other words, you've gone off and did your thing, and because of that, I'm going to divorce you. And in the Bible, that word means just what it means to us. It means total separation. In other words, God said, "I'm not gonna be married to you anymore." We serve a divorced God. Sometimes we forget that, don't we? We serve a divorced God. God divorced Israel. He said, because of who you are, what you were, what you did, your infidelity, I'm going to do away with you. And so that's one aspect of this. One aspect that he brings up at the beginning. And he uses a marriage comparison to bring that up. But he also, in 3, which is difficult for us, I understand, but it doesn't mean it's not here. We don't have to deal with it a little bit. And I kind of glazed over it last week, and I thought, well, I really need to go back and tackle this. So I thought, well, I'd go back and tackle it a little bit. This is a problem we've fought in the church for years, right, when it comes to marriage and divorce. And that is the age-old, I guess it's age-old, very old, this argument about divorce and remarriage. And here Paul brings this up. In the way he brings it up, he says, if her husband is living and she is joined to another man, then she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she's free from the law. The reason we have to tackle this a little bit is because it really has to deal with what's coming up in the end of 7, and we have to kind of understand what Paul's saying here in order for this to make sense. So there's kind of an age-old conundrum about divorce and remarriage, and it's something that, we all know people are divorced. I came from a divorced household. I don't really want to get into the divorce remarriage argument too much, but you kind of got to broach it a little here. So the deal is that the argument has been for a long time is that if a man or woman divorce, that even though they've divorced on paper, they've legally separated, legally done that in God's eyes, that never really occurs. So basically, once they remarry or whatever, they live in a state of adultery. Now that's how come some people, and because of that, a lot of times throughout history, churches have said, well, the only thing you can do would be to leave that person that you remarried and be married back to the person you originally married, would be the only way to do that. In other words, it's a continuing sin. Well, there's a lot we could talk about here. My view on this is that's not true. It's not a continuing sin. It's a one-time sin. But Paul, in this Jewish, I guess, respect, like I said, we'd have to look at this a whole lot deeper than maybe we can do right here. But his argument here basically is that if her husband is still living and she's joined to another, she'd be called an adulteress. Husband dies, she's free from the law. So in other words, the reason Paul brings this parallel up is that he's basically saying Israel can't still be married to God because it's dead, you see. In other words, once her husband dies, she's free. When Jesus died, basically it severed that covenant. It severed that relationship. If there hadn't been a death, in other words, Paul says, well, then you could kind of exist like Israel's still going and Christianity's still going and this whole thing's still together, you see. In other words, there's still two paths, if that makes any sense. Israel would still be a path and Christianity would still be a path. But what Paul's trying to say here is that no, that's not what's happened because of this death. But now, like I said last time, you got to look at there's two different ideas of death here. And that's how come I have to talk about this because of the end of 7. There's two different ideas of death involved here. One idea of death is Jesus Christ dying on the cross. That's one aspect, but that's really not, I don't think, what Paul wants you to see in 7. What he does want you to see is that it's Romans 6, okay? The beginning of Romans 6, you remember that, he says, how can he who died to sin live any longer therein? Remember that? How he who died, right? So in other words, when we're baptized into Christ, we, according to the scripture, we die, right? We die, okay? So that's another aspect that we got to talk about as we talk about this. He says, therefore, my brethren, you were made to die to the law, right? So in other words, he's saying, you're married to the law or you're married to Christ. One or the other, all right? When you, as a Jew, right? When you as a Jew, when you're baptized into Christ, you die. And because of that, you're joined to Christ. In other words, you don't have a dual status here. You're not still married to the law, you see, because you've died, you see. If you hadn't died, according to what Paul says in 3, if you hadn't died, then essentially you'd have to go back to that law. You'd be considered an adulteress, you see. So because you've died, you can no longer be joined to that. In other words, that is severed. That, because of death, that is severed. He says you've made to die to law so that you might be joined to another. Okay? So why do you think, and I know we talked about this last week, but I thought we had to go back. So why do you think that this is all compared to marriage in the Bible? Have you ever thought about that? Why is this marriage analogy so prevalent in Scripture? Right? In other words, why do you think that is? Why do you think? Because, God and Israel, the analogy of them is that Israel was the bride, right? In other words, Israel was this bride. The church is the bride of Christ, right? Why do you think that analogy is so big in Scripture? I mean, even Paul in Corinthians, he says, when he talks about marriage, he's not talking about marriage, I'm talking about Christ and the church, right? So this marriage analogy is really big in the Bible. Why do you think that's such a big thing? Yeah, what is marriage essentially? It's a what? Huh? Yeah, it's a contract, right? Isn't marriage a contract? I mean, isn't that exactly what it is? You stand up and you say, I agree to do this, I agree to do this. You sign on the dotted line, right? I mean, essentially, marriage is a contract between two people that say, I'm going to do what I say I'm going to do. And when you violate the contract, then any contract, not just marriage, but when one party violates a contract, what happens to the contract? It's dissolved, right? Or we go to court and we sue each other. Right? so when we violate a contract, then that contract you violate the terms, it's no longer valid. It's no longer a valid contract. But there's another thing you need to consider about this relationship, this parallel, okay, that we're missing here. And that's that, can you be forcibly made to join in a contract? Can somebody force you to sign a contract? If they do, is that contract valid? No, it's not right. It's not valid, right? You have to be of sound mind, right? You have to be of sound mind, and you can't be coerced into signing a contract. Otherwise, it's void. So, now think with me for a minute. I'm getting to a point here. So, Israel, did they decide to join the contract with God? Did they make a decision to do that? Or was it just because of Abraham? God made a promise to Abraham. Abraham contracted with God, right? Abraham covenanted with God. Remember that? Abraham had that vision and cut the animals in half and the lampstands. Remember that passage? And he walked between them and signified the contract between God and Abraham. So Abraham had a contract with God. But did Israel have a contract with God? Did Israel agree to follow God? When did Israel make a contract with God? Yeah, but like I said, you can't be forced to join a contract. In other words, you can't be, essentially, if you're Jewish, right, you're circumcised on the 8th day and you're a Jew. Can you consciously make a decision on the 8th day of your life to be a Jew? Well, so what happened? I have to understand this, or this isn't going to make sense. So God takes Israel out of Egypt. We know that story. Crosses the Red Sea, takes them to the mountain of God, right? Exodus, right? A lot of chapters of Exodus deal with this. And basically, if you read that account in Exodus, what happened was God took them to the mountain, and Moses got up, and Moses says, listen to me, people. He says, you have a decision to make here, right? I'm the God who delivered you, who took you out of Egypt. If you decide to serve me, I'll be your God, you'll be my people. I'm going to take you to the land that I promised Abraham. I'm going to bless you, I'm going to protect you. Do you agree to this? And the children of Israel says, yes, we agree. And Moses, this is before Moses went up on the mountain, okay? And Moses took an animal, a bull, I think, I can't remember, I have to read this again, took a bull, sacrificed on the altar, and sprinkled Israel with the blood. Because in any covenant, you have to have a what? You have to have a physical sign of covenant, any covenant, right? Isn't that right? Covenants you have to have something that physically binds a covenant. I mean, if you had a covenant and you didn't sign it, is it valid? When you get married, what do? You give each other a what? Right? Covenants have physical signs. Physical signs. Even back in the day, way back in the day when people were really, really poor and didn't have money for rings, and the minister would come to a town and marry somebody, he would say, put your hands out, and they would put their hands out, and he would take a rope, and he would tie a knot over their hands. You ever heard that term, tie a knot? They tied the knot? Well, that's where that comes from. They couldn't afford a ring. So he'd put their hands out there, and he'd take a rope, and he'd tie their hands, tie a knot around their hands. Physical sign of covenant, right? Tied the knot. That's where that comes from. Even when they couldn't afford a ring. You sign a contract, right? In the old days, when a king would make a contract, he would punch it with his signet ring in wax, right? He would seal it. Seal the contract. So that's what Moses did. Moses took this blood, made this sacrifice, sprinkled Israel with the blood. They made a decision. You'll be our God, we'll be your people. Moses goes up on the mountain. Children of Israel build a golden calf. Moses comes down. God says, I'm not going to go with you to the promised land. Why did God say that? Because what? Because what happened? Broke the covenant. right? God wasn't bound anymore. Not because God didn't honor the covenant, but because Israel didn't honor the covenant. And God says, I'm not going with you, right? I'm not going to go with you to this land. I'm going to send my angel before you to drive out the Amorite, the Hizrite, the Perizzite, but I will not go before you because I might destroy you along the way, God says. And Moses interceded, right? And then God did what? God took Moses up on the mountain, made another set of tablets, renewed the covenant with Israel, you see? Renewed the covenant. And once he did that, then he became the people. Now, the reason I bring this up is because, let's jump ahead a few hundred years. So time goes on, right? Time goes on. Now, he made that covenant, sprinkled that blood with them people of the mountain. They go to the Jordan River. They don't cross over. They wander 40 years in the wilderness. All the men who are fighting age who were able to go across the Jordan all perished in the wilderness, and a new group comes back to the Jordan, right? And God renews the covenant with them. If you really read that account, which is very interesting to me, when they go back to the river, they hadn't even kept the covenant of circumcision. They had to all be circumcised again and heal up before they could cross the Jordan. They had quit with that covenant of circumcision. They weren't even honoring that. But the reason I bring this up is so the Jews, every Jew that was born, they were going on the covenant of their forefathers, right? They didn't make that decision. They were born a Jew. Am I right? They were born a Jew. Right, but they were born into it. In other words, they didn't decide. Each one of them didn't decide to make that covenant with God, did they? They didn't choose to do it. They were born into it. It was who they were, in other words. You see? But here, as we begin to look at Romans 7, you really have to understand that. We have to make a decision to covenant with God, each one of us, to be a Christian, to be in the church. We have to make that decision. Just because I was born to somebody who was a member of the church doesn't make me a member of the church. We all agree with that, right? Doesn't do that. I have to make a decision to covenant with God. You see, we're talking about that here. Dying to something, living to something else. Now, I don't die to the law when I'm baptized because I'm not Jewish. I'm not bound to the law, you see? I'm not bound to that. But according to what Paul would say, I'm bound to a law of sin, right? A law of unrighteousness, right? Until I join myself to Christ. So there's a lot to think about when we begin to make this analogy and we begin to go through Romans 7. And I really thought, well, Rex, you need to go back and we need to talk about this a little bit because when we get to the bottom of 7, we're going to struggle with a lot of things. And a lot of it has to do with a lot of these ideas that I'm talking to you about here. While we were in the flesh, right? Sinful passions aroused by the law. Why does he say that? Sinful passions aroused by the law were at work in the members of our body to bear fruit for death. How are sinful passions aroused by the law? Without law, there's no sin, right? Do you think sometimes people, yeah, Ray? Oh, yeah, we're getting there. Yeah, that's how come we're taking some time to build our case. Yeah, because we're fixing to be there, Ray. Yeah, yeah. It gets very confusing, I agree. That's what I said. It gets a lot worse as we go. So if we don't kind of get the flow of what's going on here, we get to the bottom, we're just totally going to be lost. We're going to be lost anyway, because I promise you, scholars have written volumes of books about the ends of Romans 7, and nobody agrees. So we're going to be lost at the end of 7. That's all right. Everybody is. Not just us. People that are a whole lot smarter than me, that have been to all kinds of universities, have doctor's degrees, don't understand the end of Romans 7. So it's all right. It's all right. That's right. We're going to get through it. Yeah. Right. I think a lot of what he says here, though, is just almost the idea sometimes that people like to do what's wrong, right? People sometimes are drawn to do what's wrong, right? In other words, just the idea of sometimes breaking the law is a little bit exciting, right? And I think that's kind of what he's talking about here. He says, now we have been released from the law, having died to that which we're bound, so that we serve in newness of spirit and not in oldness of the letter. And that's pretty straightforward. So what shall we say then? Is the law sin? May it never be, Paul says. On the contrary, I would not have come to know sin except through the law, for I would not have known about the coveting, if the law had said, you shall not covet. But sin, taking opportunity through me, through the commandment, produced the coveting of every kind. For apart from the law, sin was dead. This is where it really starts to get confusing. So, he uses an example, coveting. What does it mean to covet something? To want someone else's something. But I think coveting goes beyond that, right? It's not just that you might want it, because it's all right if you see something somebody has, you say, man, I'd like to have one of those. I'll just go buy me one, right? I mean, that's right. I mean, that's okay. But if you really read this commandment in the Bible, it says, you shall not covet what? Yeah, right. In other words, he's talking about coveting things you can't have, right? So coveting in this respect is not just coveting something that your neighbor has. Well, I sure like his pickup. It's the idea of coveting to the point that, well, you know, if I break his legs, maybe I can get his pickup, right? You know, I mean, but it's also about coveting stuff that is unattainable. In other words, if you covet your neighbor's wife, that's off limits. You should never be able to have that. So coveting is a little deeper than just the idea of, I saw somebody's whatever and I kind of would like to have that. I mean, it's a little bit deeper idea than that. And he says, but what does he say? He says, but sin, taking opportunity through the commandment, produced in me coveting of every kind. For apart from the law, sin is dead. Why does he say that? Coveting of every kind. It was ox either. In other words, though sin made it real in his life, right? The law made it real in his life. In other words, once the law came around, he realized that, that's a sin, right? I mean, I want that, and that's a sin. Or I desire that, and that's a sin. It made it alive, in other words, made it to be real. So he says, for once I was alive apart from the law, when the commandment came, sin became alive, and I died. This is going to get a whole lot worse, people. We're just on the tip of the iceberg here. So he says, when I was alive apart from the law, I was once alive apart from the law. In other words, there was a time in Paul's life, this is a big argument with a lot of scholars, what he's talking about here. I don't know why we have to argue it. There was a point in Paul's life where he was apart from the law. Point when he was a child, when the law didn't really make that much to him, didn't really matter to him, right? But once he accepted that, and we're going right back to what I was talking about here. So the Jews born into Judaism, born into being a Jew, circumcised on the 8th day, Paul said, Hebrew of Hebrews, right? But there's some point in that Jew's life when he has to decide, I'm going to be a Jew, right? And in Judaism, when did that happen? When did a male, and I guess we got to stay on the male side because I guess there is something for girls too. I can't remember what that's called now. Does anybody know what that's called? Anyway, for a male Jew, when did he decide to be a Jew? When he was turning 13, right? Bar mitzvah. There was significance in Jesus being left to the temple when he was 12 years old. There was significance in the 12. Because that's when you decide to be a Jew. So even though you're born into it, and even though you're circumcised on the 8th day, there still comes a point in your life when you have to decide to covenant. You have to decide to be a Jew. No different from Paul. Does this make any sense at all? Do y'all understand what I'm saying? You can't be forced into a covenant, right? We'll go right back to this idea. You can't be forced into a contract. You can be born into it, but you can't be forced into it. You still, at some point in your life, you have to decide to honor the contract or to not honor the contract. And there's a physical sign of a contract, right? We talked about that. And in Judaism, the physical sign of entering the contract is their bar mitzvah. That's their physical sign of becoming a Jew, actually becoming a Jew, of accepting the contract. Dear, when I was raised Baptist, 12 years was the age of accountability when I was growing up. By 12, you better have it figured out. At 13, if you died, you were going to hell. You better have it figured out at 12. That's just totally wrong. I'm just throwing that out there. Well, I agree. There's a lot of pressure, family pressure to do it beyond any doubt. And at 13, I don't know that you're strong enough to stand up against the pressure of your family. But eventually in your life, you are going to have to make a decision. You're either going to be a Jew or you're not going to be a Jew, right? Or I guess you're always going to be a Jew. Maybe that's the wrong way to say it. You got to decide if you're going to participate in Judaism or not participate in Judaism, right? Because you have to make that decision. So he says when the commandment came, in other words, when I accepted the law, sin became alive and I died. Because Paul understands that there's no way to get to heaven without Christ, right? And this commandment, which was to result in life, proved to result in death for me. So in other words, he says, the idea is to keep the law and to be righteous and to that should be how law works. That should be how this worked. But he says, because the law made me see my error, see my sin, and there was no way to get rid of this sin that the law imposed upon me, it resulted in death. Right? Spiritual death, in other words. We're not talking about dying. Resulted in spiritually. Because he said, because as the scripture says, you can't keep the law perfectly, right? In other words. For sin took an opportunity through the commandment, deceived me, and through it killed me. So then the law is holy, the commandment is holy and righteous and good. So he said, it's not in the law. Therefore, did that which is good become a cause of death for me? May it never be. Rather, it was sin in order that it might be shown to sin. This is where this is so confusing. So, the reason Romans 7 right here gets so confusing is because Paul puts a personification on sin. That's my opinion of this. In other words, he makes sin a thing, like its own entity. In other words, like it has an ability within itself. He gives it a personification. Do you understand what I'm saying? He makes it a person. If you really read what we've been reading, do you see that, what Paul's doing to it? He's making it. Okay, hold on a minute. I want to go back to here. But sin, taking opportunity through the commandment. In other words, he personified it. He said, there's this person. Let's call it a person. This person sinned. Okay? The Bible does this a lot. If you ever read Proverbs, when it talks about wisdom, it talks about wisdom in a feminine gender, right? You know, she, her. And so Jews made that a person, Sophia, a personification of wisdom, okay? Here Paul makes a personification, sin, makes it a person. But sin taking opportunity through the commandment. So he makes sin a person. Not Satan, not the devil, but sin. This is, I think, why this gets so confusing. And he says, because if you look at this, it says, for sin. Once again, you see, it's personified. Taking an opportunity through the commandment deceived me, and through it killed me. In other words, this sin, this personification of sin that Paul is putting forth here, it has its own nature. It has its own ability. It has its own function, you see. We think of Satan. We think of influence. But here Paul has taken sin and made it a person. And he said this sin, this person's sin, right, it took an opportunity and deceived me. Doesn't say that Satan did it. Doesn't say the devil did it. It says that sin did it, right? So sin's become this own little evil monster. And this sin is something that Paul can't seem to get rid of in his life because the law inherently makes it in his face all the time. Because he knows whatever he thinks, whatever thought he has, whatever, it's sin, you see. He's not blaming Satan for this, you see. But he says the law is holy, right? Command of good. Therefore, did that which is good because it caused death be may never be. Rather, it was what? It was this sin. It was this sin, right? In order that it might be shown to be sin by affecting my death through the commandment, sin would become utterly sinful. You see this personification of sin? This sin now is become a person. And this little sin person, I'm really trying to do the best I can with this, people. You got to work with me. This little sin person, right? He's become this cause of death in Paul. Because Paul can't escape it. He can't escape this little sin guy. He doesn't say it's Satan. I really want to stress that point. Because I think sometimes when we read this passage, we think, oh, well, he's battling Satan and good. You know, like the devil and the angel on the shoulder. But that's not what he's saying. It's not what he's saying. He's saying, I'm battling myself. Right? I'm battling me. Because I have this innate ability to sin. And because the law shows me this sin, then I've got this little sin person that's destroying me, and I can't do anything about it. Because the law can't do anything about this little sin guy. All it can do is show me this guy, right? Make him real. Make me feel bad. Make me have sin in my life. That's all law can do. The law doesn't give me a way to get rid of this little sin guy. It just shows him to me every day. Are we?
Trying to say you're not under this anymore, but without it, you wouldn't know what sin was.
Right, but since I'm under it.
Condemned when we were under it because there was no, you couldn't be reconciled. You couldn't be redeemed under the law.
Right, there's no way the law can remove sin. Right.
So while he was under that,
you're stuck.
he was dead.
Right. You're stuck with this little sin guy.
And you're not under it today, but without it, we wouldn't know what sin is.
Right. Right. This is the best way I know to approach this passage. Right? In other words, the law, there was no way to get rid of the sin guy. He was just there. You couldn't get rid of him. You couldn't do away with him. Because every time you broke one of them laws, every time you broke commandment, every time you coveted something, every time you did any of those things, right? Sin was there. There was no way to get rid of it. So I had to live with this little sin guy in me all the time that I couldn't get rid of. And because of that, I was bound to this death. Are we gaining? Are we making any sense? Because under the law, there's no way to get rid of it, you see. It was sin, right? Shown sin, but he says, so that the commandment, sin would become utterly sinful. This sin person, right, would become utterly sinful. In other words, there's no redemption here. No way to get rid of this. It's this guy's here, and I can't get him out of my house. That's the best way I know to say what we've been saying. I hope this somewhat makes sense. I really thought about how am I going to approach this. So he says, yeah. It's, yeah, but it's like if you had a child and every day they did something, you never praised them, you never said they did anything good, right? You just put a bunch of laws in their life that you knew they couldn't keep all of them. And every time they broke one of them laws, you whacked them over the wrist with a ruler and said, "You bad kid, look what you did. You broke this law." Right? And that goes on in their life day after day. After a while, what do you think the mentality of that child's going to be? Yeah, it's defeatist, right? I can't do a thing right, right? There's no way there's nothing I can do right. Yeah, Corky. Under the law of Moses, under the law, a lot of that sin, there was no way out of it. There was no, a defiant sin under the law, there was no forgiveness for that. And now I'm talking about the law, I'm not talking about us. Because that's what Paul's talking about. That's where he was. That's the life he lived. There was things in Judaism. There were a lot of sin, breaking of the law under Judaism. Defiant sin. There was no forgiveness under Judaism for it. Yeah, the law showed you your sin. The law convicted you of your sin, but the law gave you no way to get rid of your sin. It was just continually, it was oppressive. And after a while, you come to the point, like that child would come to the point, that I can't do this. I cannot make you happy. I cannot do everything you want me to do. So therefore, I'm just done trying. You think you would get to that point after a while in life? Sure you do. Absolutely, we all do. If you're criticized enough in a marriage, if you're criticized enough as a child, if you're criticized enough eventually, any human being, no matter how strong they are, will get to the point where they'll say, "I can't do anything right and I'm done trying." Right? Don't you agree with that? Well, absolutely. But to me, this has gone on for hundreds of years. Right? For I know that nothing good dwells in me, Paul says. That, we're stopping here because I can't go here. I will never make it through this. Anyway, I hope you're starting to get a grasp of what's going on because it's going to get a whole lot worse as we get to the bottom of this. So I hope I'm helping. I hope I'm not hurting. I've thought a lot about how to approach this. You can read 500 commentaries on the end of Romans 7 and nobody agrees with each other. So you gotta, I had to kind of approach it my own way, and hopefully it'll make sense when we're done. And if not, then I guess I'm not very good at this either. So thanks for your time.